So if you're out to change the world, this is a good place to start. Please join me in welcoming Paul Shoemaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Barb. So we live in a fundamentally different world than we did at the turn of the millennium. We are evolving from a bell curve world to a U-shaped world. I'll explain that in a minute. It calls for a new kind of leadership, and it absolutely calls for a new kind of leaders, the kind of people that are in this room today. So I am really excited to be here with you today, Alberta, to talk to you about a U-shaped world, and most importantly, how I believe it's relevant to all of you and the work that you're trying to do today and into the future. All the slides I'm talking about, by the way, are going to be accessible, if that helps to know that. Okay, before I dive into some other stuff, for all of you that, like me, didn't pay much attention in Stats 101 class, let's do a quick refresher on Bell Curve 101 and standard deviations and normal distributions. Sounds like fun, right? So when I started into this work, I thought to myself, where did this thing ever come from in the first place? So this sort of dapper fellow here, his name's Abraham de Moivre. He's an 18th century statistician. He was a consultant to gamblers. And they called upon him to make computations about how the dice would roll, for obvious reasons. And he figured out, if I can figure out a mathematical expression for that curve, I might be able to solve those problems better. And that's what he did. And the curve he came up with is called the normal curve or the bell curve. So in case you were wondering where it came from, that's it. So this is it. It's this curve that describes sort of the instances of a lot of natural occurring things in the world. 68% of everything's within one standard deviation, either side of the mean. I'm just curious, with a show of hands, how many people in this room know how many percent exist between three standard deviations either way? Anybody know that? There's a couple. Those are the true nerds in the room. If you know that, you are a super duper nerd. So a bell curve matters because it represents the distributions of a lot of natural phenomenon. Things like the sum of rolling two dice. Things like milk production from cows. Things like the birth weight of newborns. I also saw one for the amount of projected goals in a season by Ovechkin, but I decided to leave that one off. The bell curve is also an anchor for me in how I'm trying to think about this and talk to you today about leadership in a U-shaped world. There'll be a quiz at the end for extra credit. So, now that we're done with Stats 101, let me sort of start with a little bit of context here to set up why I believe we are living in a fundamentally different world. I'm going to throw some data at you briefly. I'll talk you through it. The point isn't specific data points, it's the general picture that it's going to present. And a bell curve can help us not only understand a cow's milk production, it can also help us understand economic and social progress, which is what we care about here today. So let's start with, I want to look at sort of a few signs of progress in the second half of the 20th century, post-World War II. So this is economic prosperity per capita. Up and down is dollar value, across is years. This shows a whole number of countries, and it's the story of sort of constant progress over that 50 years. For a long time, that progress had broadened the middle class, it fueled our consumer-driven economy, and it brought many, many people along with it. In case you're wondering, obviously the same is true for Canada as well. You experience that same kind of progress over that same time frame. All right, here's another one. I could have looked at health advances from dozens of perspectives. So I'm just showing you one just to sort of make the uber point here. This is about polio eradication. And as recently as 40 years ago, there were thousands of cases of polio around the world that occurred. In the last few years, we're down to 4 countries and a handful of cases, which is amazing progress. Just think about that. And by the way, the last handful of countries is really, really hard, partly given who the countries are, and just because it's hard, it's like the last mile problem for any business solution. Let me show you one more. This is literacy. So the part in the blue is folks that are literate. The part in the red are illiterate folks. And this one goes over a couple hundred years. The yellow line starts from 1950. As recently as 1950, 40% of the world was classified as illiterate. Kind of an amazing number. Therefore, the progress we made in those next 50 years was to go from 40% to 15% illiteracy around the world. We educated and helped to make literate well over 1 billion people. That is, to me, that's an amazing accomplishment. That's incredible that we did something like that. So, let me bring it back to my bell curve. If you take what I just described to you and you plotted that on a bell curve, what it would say is we have made progress for a majority of people, all those folks in the middle of the bell curve, that within 1 standard deviation, right? They've had economic prosperity, their health improved, they increased their literacy. That's the message behind this bell curve. And it's progress across most people. And it is a shared sense of progress. That's what we experienced for those 50 years. And I've been pouring through this data really for several months now. So I could show you hundreds of these. I don't want to do that to you. I'm just going to show you a handful to highlight it. I promise you what I'm showing you is, to me, what's predominant and what's kind of the trend that's out there. I've tried to avoid, by the way, being US-centric, so if I ever do that, my apologies. But what you basically get is this sense of inevitable upward positive progress in the second half of the 20th century. Pretty amazing. So let's talk a little bit more about the last 20 years. So on the other side of that economic prosperity one is this thing called income inequality. So this chart shows the total of income that's going to the top 1% in any particular country. And the visual goes over 100 years. At that purple line, there was sort of this steady progression. Around 1990, that curve started to go the other direction. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. We had economic prosperity, but we had growing income inequality. So where we are today is we're starting to see some of the negative sides, if you will, of some of those positive trends that we saw for a long time, and that we need to do some work on. That level of income and inequality, and this is in Canada as well as the US and several other developing countries, it is as unequal as it's been for nearly 100 years. That's a pretty phenomenal statistic, and it's obviously something for us to be concerned about. Public health, we made amazing advances in so many ways, but at the same time we're making advances, we're also sort of starting to go in the other direction on a few things. This one explains obesity in adults, or overweight in adults, from 0 to 50%, years and different parts of the world. Unfortunately, the Americas are at the top. So again, we've made big progress, but we are sort of simultaneously now creating some pretty significant health challenges in our world too. And let me show you one more. This is a little bit busy. So let me explain to you what this is. This is about internet freedom. And it's a study of how have countries evolved over the last couple of years. What could be sort of more free than the internet, right? So this chart looks at about 50 countries. The size of the bar is the degree of progress in either direction. And red means the internet freedom has declined, and blue means it's increased. So as you can see, there's more red than blue in this chart, which I find kind of amazing. The sort of the ultimate everything about it, source of freedom, the internet, has in fact declined in the last couple of years. If you're wondering about Canada, it's one of those countries in the gray, which means you sort of stayed where you are, which is probably a very open internet. I could show dozens more of these comparisons. If I tried to map social and economic progress on a bell curve, like I did in the last few slides, it would not fit like the one I showed you a few slides ago. The progress in the last 20 years, there is progress. It is more uneven, it's more siloed, and it's sort of less clearly positive. This isn't a reason for panic, but it is a reason for us to think about how we do business and how we lead in different ways. We also have this other thing going on right now, which I'll call them amplifiers. We all know about these. So we have social and economic progress that's getting more uneven. And then we have these incredible accelerators and amplifiers called technology and media. And they're sort of their own trends, but they're amplifiers unto themselves. So this visual is a little bit busy, but what it does along the left column is it looks at, do I possess a smartphone, a laptop, do I have broadband, do I have a tablet computer? And go in this direction looks at, depending on your income level, which one of those devices and technologies do you possess? So what it says, if you have income under 30,000, 80% of people possess those 4 devices or technologies. If you have over 100,000 in income, 71% of the world possesses those 4 things. Just think about how different that makes their lives and how different it makes their sense of opportunity. And technology does a lot of wonderful things. It is also a significant amplifier of what makes the world uneven. And I think about comparing it to, say, the post office or phones in the last century. We pretty much made sure everybody had, for the most part, equal access to them. And that's not happening as much with today's technologies. There's also this thing called media. We all know you can live in your own echo chamber now. You can have sort of your own worldview. We even see people starting to self-regulate now and sort of, check out of some of these different forms of media, get off of certain ones. So in the same way technology is an amplifier of things that are uneven, media is an amplifier of separation, of creating silos. That's an important thing for us to understand too. Just an interesting example in Canada, Edelman's a PR firm. They do a thing every year called the Trust Barometer. And this visual is looking at how does the general public trust NGOs, business sector, public sector. And it's delineating between folks in urban areas and rural areas. As recently as 2015, people's trust level in all of us in this room was relatively equal. Today, big gap. Right? That's just an example of how media has amplified the separation between us. It doesn't always do that, but it does that a lot more than it used to. So how do people think about this world and think about this future? I'm going to give you 2 slides that I think sort of try to wrap this up and summarize it, and then I'm going to talk about leadership going forward. What I just talked about is absolutely changing how people think about the future. This data from Pew Center it's across developing countries. And these kinds of data points, they haven't seen these for a long, long time. Progress doesn't seem as inevitable as it was for decades, especially in the 2010s. For me, the world seems not out of whack, but a little off compass. It creates a sense of uncertainty, at least for me, and I believe it's why people like you come to a conference like this, so we can talk about this together. And if your world, your business was sort of like one narrow slice of life or of the world, you'd probably be just fine. You could sort of like live in that slice. But if you're at a conference where business and nonprofit sector, government, educational institutions are converging to change the way we do business and impact society, you got a real issue. We're not doomed, but we got a different world that we're working in. As has always been, and I believe always will be the case, these times call for a new kind of leadership. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. And here's the way I would summarize the challenge that I'm going to try to posit some solutions to. Progress, number one, progress is no longer sort of assumed, and in some cases it's slowed or reversed. In some areas where we do have progress, it's become more uneven. Health, economics. And we are less connected and we are more siloed, which means our ability to come together to make progress on these social challenges has gotten harder. So all of that matters on its own, but if we want to see collective progress for the majority of our citizens, employees, shareholders, we need to find a way to sort of drive back towards that more virtuous bell curve. Sort of trying to solve for, this has been bugging me for the last year. This has been my uncertainty. Like, why is the world the way it is, and what are we going to do about it? That is the question I keep asking myself. And I'm not done with this at all. I'm continuing to try to work on this. I'm trying to make sense of it myself. It seems like a harder to understand world. I have 3 whiteboards in my office at home, and they're full of stuff. Some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't make sense. I have a contract on a book with HarperCollins for 2020. You are the second or the third audience I've shared this thinking with. So my job is to share what I see with you. Just know this, I would love your feedback as well. I haven't written the book yet, and I'm not sure exactly what I'll say in it. I do know some things I'm going to say, which I'll share with you. So the gist of this is we're going from a bell-shaped, bell curve world to a U-shaped world. And here's how it shows up. So to me, there's less of us in the middle making progress together or working together to make progress possible. So in economics, we have some stagnating poverty rates. We have a slowly shrinking middle class, and we have an increasing concentration of wealth amongst the top 1%. Again, that's both in the US and Canada. On health, we have sort of slowed progress on the broader population, and we definitely have a bigger delta in how healthy people are. We're not sort of, again, all sort of aligned in the middle yet, or as we used to be. We don't have as much shared economic progress, and we have a less common shared view of how the world works. So my point isn't to argue we all need to be in the same. We don't need to all be the same, or that we need to be in the middle of the bell curve. The point is the conditions that enable us to create a better world, we are now going to have a tougher time navigating them in a U-shaped world. So our work now, it's more important, and I also believe it got harder. That's just the way it is. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about leadership and what I think it needs to look like in the future. One quick little observation before I do this. I think one of the most fascinating places that this has showed up is in sort of political leadership and amongst our world leaders. I don't know if you remember the 1990s. It seems like a long, long time ago. There was sort of all this progress towards, I don't know if you call it the middle, but towards, moderation and figuring out how to work together. And we have this world now that I can't totally explain. Regardless of how you feel about that guy from the States, I'm not quite sure why he likes to hang out with the people he likes to hang out with. But we sure in the hell don't have as many people hanging out in the middle anymore. We got a lot of people hanging out at both ends of that curve. We have a very U-shaped world out there politically in terms of our leaders. And that doesn't affect us day to day, but it certainly affects the context that we all live in and that we all work in. So I think a lot has been written about sort of how the world's changing and evolving. What I don't see nearly as much about is what kind of leadership needs to exist. I spent 15 years in the private sector. I spent 20 years in the nonprofit sector. I've hung around people sort of from all sectors, rooms of people like you, and I hope that gives me a perspective on how leadership needs to play out. So another one of the whiteboards in my office at home has got all these Venn diagrams on it. I've tried to think about those people that I know that I think represents the right kind of leader for the future. So again, very messy, and a lot of different traits sort of in different parts of the Venn diagram. But I will say this, there are 3 traits that keep popping up for me again and again and again. And I'm going to describe those 3 characteristics to you. There are more, I'll probably come up with more in my research, but to me, these 3 are paramount. And I'm going to give you some of the example of each one of them. So the first one is what I call 24/7 authenticity. So you probably recognize one of the two guys in that main picture. That's Lance Armstrong. He's not the story here. The story here is the guy he's got his arm around. His name's Doug Ullman. So Ullman was his director at his organization when Armstrong went bad. And the way Ullman handled it was through utter, complete, and total transparency and authenticity. I think that's who he is. He also had no choice. I would say another reason to be 24/7 authentic is we got no choice. The world's going to figure us out if we're not. So there's a good reason to do it. There's also sort of a survival reason to do it. And I think it also involves things like being vulnerable enough to say to your team and your people, what am I uncertain about? That's a great example of where 24/7 authenticity shows up. In a world of fake news, this cannot be a transitory commitment. This needs to be who you are. And again, this is sort of beyond honesty. This is getting ahead of the curve. This is being transparent before you need to be. This is being authentic as a core part of who you fundamentally are. And I would say for each one of us, this one, it's kind of free, right? It's not easy. We have to make some personal decisions, and we have to have some hard conversations with ourselves. But this one is there for us to use if we want to. And by the way, I plopped that guy in the lower right corner because I think he's a great example of a guy that is not and has lost his way. If you don't know who that is, that's Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. I think the dude's really lost his way. I think he's lost his authenticity. I hope he can re-find it. I'm not really sure about that. But I think he's a great example of somebody that does not practice that principle, at least in my mind. Trait number 2, I'm going to call it complexity dexterity. Also known as you better have women in the room. I'm not being politically correct here. So that woman's Maria Eitel. She works for Nike. In the 90s, Nike's supply chain in Asia was a mess. It was a disaster. A few of you might remember this. I mean, if it had been these times, for all I know, it could have taken them under. But they got a lot of heat. And to their credit, they recognized it. And she was the person they put on point to go try to figure this out. How do we solve this? What are we going to do about this? And they did an awful lot to change their supply chain. And Maria's the person that did it. And I also had a recent assignment where I was trying to put 3 organizations together. It were 3 medical health institutions. They were led by 2 men and their boards were chaired by women. And we had a moment of opportunity to get the 3 of them to integrate in a way that would have been just fantastic and revolutionary. And 2 of the board chairs shifted to men, and the deal fell apart. So I'm not here to say, guys, we don't matter. I'm telling you sincerely, in my experience, for me, for example, this is the hardest one for me to practice. I'm a relatively linear thinker. This requires you to be able to think beyond the explicit. This involves patience, collective thinking, listening, put all the parts together. And just bluntly said, women are better at complexity. That's not politically correct. I just believe that. I've seen it time and time again. Guys, we're great at carrying a rock up the hill from point A to point B, but when things get messy, we're just not quite as good. The point is we need both in the room. But I'm serious. If you're trying to solve a complex problem, you better have some women in the room along with the guys. And for each of you, I think for us, this is about finding experiences that we put ourselves into that will test our ability to deal with complexity. Right? How dexterous can we be about that? And it's also about finding mentors that are good at this. So I'm working on this one on an awful lot because I'm not so good at this one. I got progress I got to make. The last one I'm going to suggest to you guys is called cross-sector fluidity. This guy right here is David Risher. He was a tech guy. Then he was a nonprofit guy. He works on an organization called World Reader. He's trying to solve that literacy problem we talked about a few slides ago. And he's doing it in countries around the world. And to do that, he's got to work with a lot of governments in those countries. So this guy has figured out how to work across all three sectors. I've had to do that too, kind of organically in the course of my work. The challenges we have today, they don't exist in silos. I think you know that because you showed up here. If a company wants to be economically successful, its leaders have to understand how to navigate the public sector, as well as the social sector and the community around them. If you are a social sector entity trying to make progress on an intractable problem, you cannot do it without the public sector. They have the scale, and the private sector is a significant asset for you to work with. If you're a public sector entity, you need the ground truth that NGOs have, and you need the community credibility the private sector has. All those things are true. Every one of those sectors needs each other now. Not as a nice to have, not as a want to have, as a have to have. And that is a fundamentally different world than we live in. And it also, by the way, used to be, when I came into this work 20 years ago, this was kind of arrogant. The common assumption used to be the private sector has a lot of things to teach the nonprofit and the public sector. Partly true, partly not true. What's absolutely true today is the other way around is also true. Nonprofits deal with complexity all the time. And people in the private sector, I think, can learn from that. So it's a two-way street now, much more than it used to be. And look at your afternoon breakouts. You're talking about B Corps, you're looking at ESG, you're looking at market approaches to social impact. I think on this one, for each of you, you can gain this skill. You have to be intentional about it. You have to find and create the experiences to expose yourself across sectors. If I had to pick one person that I think represents all of those, sort of all rolled up together, it's this woman. Her name's Michelle Nunn. She's the CEO of Care USA. And I've known her for a long time. A few months ago, I was hanging out with her. And as I sit and listen to her sort of talk, she's able to sort of pivot effortlessly across all three sectors. She had just gotten back from visiting refugee camps in Syria. That was a couple months ago. I can only imagine what it's like now. She talked about how she works with the CEO of major companies, including PepsiCo, on their supply chain. And she also talks about their interactions with governmental institutions like the USAID. And she did it just as naturally as you possibly could. And on the heels of all that, she was also a candidate for the US Senate in 2014. So she has this kind of native fluidity across all three of these sectors that I think is a hallmark of leadership that the world needs and demands in the future. Those four people, to me, represent the kind of leadership a U-shaped world demands. So before I start to wrap up here for a minute, I've asked one of our afternoon breakout speakers to make a quick comment about some of these new ways of doing business and new types of leaders I'm talking about here. That's Kevin. He advises companies and investors on responsible investment practices. He will be in the Finding Capital session this afternoon. Kevin, we've seen huge calls for this kind of work to change recently. Any thoughts you want to share or add to that? I needed like 5 more seconds to give you time to get up here.
All right. Good.
Go.
So first of all, I think you're right. We're seeing a lot of changes in not just in the way that people express these ideas, but even the sort of thought about who's collaborating and who's in the room. One really interesting part recently, I think you've seen this kind of discussion in the United States with Business Roundtable, collection of all the biggest CEOs saying, you know what, we're not just responsible to the shareholders anymore, right. Now we're responsible to stakeholders. I have some issues with that, generally speaking, but it's something we're quite familiar with here in Canada because it's reflected in our laws even, that companies are responsible to stakeholders. The question now is, what does that all mean? And it means we're in this situation with quite difficult world to navigate. What we're going to talk about this afternoon are not what I always get asked, what's the one system that I as a company can use to satisfy that responsible investor voice out there? What kind of reporting can I do? And is there just an easy answer? There isn't, right?
Absolutely.
But there are signposts, there are principles we can work with, and they have to do with this very kind of idea about collaboration, dialogue, communication, about aligning your values and principles top to bottom. I think you talked a bit about that. Yep. And also looking at the trajectory of your company. So I'm going to get into that later. Excellent. But there's some great work happening we can get into.
Fantastic. Thank you. So that's sort of a sneak preview this afternoon. I also want to just sort of point out, suggest there's a couple leaders in this room today and tomorrow that very much, I think, represent this. Your keynote speaker tomorrow, I spent a lot of time sort of studying him, Tim. One of his favorite lines that I saw him state was, social responsibility is strategically vital to our business. Again, we've gone from faking it to nice to have to want to have to, if we want to be in business, we have to work this way. We literally do. We have to do work this way. And my friend Brad, he started Creative Destruction Labs to try to stimulate more entrepreneurship. One of the parts of that is a high school girls program. I'm going to guess it was a sort of a personal connection to that. But I also don't think he did it for the hell of it. I think he did that for an economic reason. He believes that's a source of entrepreneurship. And I will reinforce that because, like I said, that gender, in my experience, they are better at dealing with complexity. So I would be willing to invest in the high school girls program. So to start to wrap us up, this sort of slightly geeky discussion about bell curves and U-shaped world, they really matter. I'm trying to suggest we want to reverse that trend. This is not just about addressing social challenges, it is. This is not just about restoring confidence in the public sector, it is. It's not just a way to create wealth and private sector competitive advantage, but it is. As has always been and always been the case, these times call for a new kind of leadership. And like all change, somebody said this earlier, there's clearly uncertainty, but that uncertainty also is absolutely an opportunity for new leaders. This is when new people step up. I'm slightly daunted by the times we live in and the things I just talked to you about and living in a U-shaped world. I would say more than that, I'm excited. As I'm starting to get my brain around it, I'm getting more excited. And frankly, no BS, hanging out in a room seeing a room full of people like you, I start to get even more confident and more excited. You all are on the leading edge of that bell curve. You're ahead of the bell curve. You are what's obviously called the leading edge, also occasionally known as the bleeding edge. But think about two of those stories I gave you, Maria and Doug. Maria was in a complete hot mess at Nike, and Doug was in a complete hot mess at Livestrong. And what came out of those disasters and out of those wildly uncertain times, because they exhibited those leadership principles, was huge opportunity for growth. Both of those organizations moved forward because they practiced that kind of leadership before anyone like I ever sort of said how to do it. They were that authentic, they were that dexterous, right? And they were understood how to work cross-sector. I love the description of this conference. It's where business, the nonprofit sector, government, and educational institutions converge to change the way we do business and impact society. So the last thought I'll give you is a way to roll up what I think about leadership. Jim Collins is a person I really admire. He wrote a book, Good to Great. I'm sure most of you know that. He defined this kind of leadership called Level 5 leadership. It's about the private sector and about how really powerful leaders have a combination of humility and will. And I'll leave you with a thought, which is what I described to you today was what I'll call level 15 leaders. People that can work across not just one sector as a level 5 leader, but can work across all 3 sectors. 3 times 5 equals 15. Level 5 leaders. It's about authenticity. It's about dealing with complexity. It's about being cross-sector. We do live in a fundamentally different world. We absolutely, positively do. We're evolving from a bell-shaped to a U-shaped world. We don't know if it's going to stay that way. But what this is it's all about leaders like you that can navigate uncertain times in the U-shaped world. So the question I would invite you to answer for yourself and to be curious about over the next day and a half is, what kind of leader am I called to be now? Thank you for your time. I got about 5 minutes. If you want to do a couple quick questions from the crowd, we can do that. And then I'm going to turn it back to other folks. But thank you for your attention very much. Are there a couple questions? Yep.
How has failure contributed to your success?
How has failure contributed to my success? That's always a great opening question. This is true of everybody, I think. Without a doubt, you learn more from your failures than your successes. The only problem is it sucks when you're in the middle of it. I did a startup in the 90s. We thought it was a great idea. Literally, my wife and I just had a 3-month-old baby. We moved all the way across the country. And 6 months later, I knew I blew it. I was wrong. And there's a ton of lessons I took away from that. I would say what I learned from that failure was I was too much of a ready, fire, aim person. I wasn't patient enough. I also didn't study the people involved enough. This ball game's all about the people, right? And what I also learned was it was amazingly hard in the middle of the failure to learn anything from it. I was just trying to survive and swim upstream and, keep my family with our young baby sort of hanging together and keep my wife and I from not wanting to, keep her from not wanting to kill me. I think failure is an amazing teacher. It's hard to do it in the middle of it. It sucks when you're in the middle of it. And you have to be intentional about it when you're done failing to go back and say, what did I learn from that? That's a powerful teacher. We all do fail. What else? Great question. One or two other questions. Yep.
Paul, you live in a city with the two most valuable companies in the world, Microsoft and Amazon. And in this U-shaped world, isn't mega billion philanthropy projects like the Gates Foundation, whatever Bezos gets up to, going to solve all these problems?
Awesome question. So Brad's question was, I live in this city with two of the 5 most valuable companies in the world, Microsoft and Amazon. I'm not sure where Google, Facebook, and Apple stack up, but it's those 5. So is the solution that these mega billionaires we're creating, are they sort of going to solve the world's problems? So number one, Gates said we can't do it by ourselves, and I believe them. There's something really powerful about philanthropy. There is also something, philanthropy can be amazingly wonderful and insanely arrogant. I think everybody in the room probably knows that. It depends so much on the person. So I think there's a caution about how, and their lack of accountability is, I'm not sure how to solve it, it's a problem though. They're literally accountable to no one. So don't get me wrong, the reason the polio will probably be eradicated is a lot to do with the Gates Foundation, that's great. But Jeff Bezos and Bill and Melinda Gates and Mackenzie Bezos, they don't have enough money to solve these problems. It's absolutely got to be the public sector. Anybody that gets deep enough into this work realizes what private capital can do is take risk and fill gaps and be experimenting. But the public sector, if you want to truly systemically solve a problem, you've got to engage the public sector. And again, that speaks to the point about how one of the most important traits of any leader is this ability to be fluid cross-sector. Great question, Brad. How about one more and then I'll get out of the way and keep everybody on time. Anything else on anybody's mind? Yep.
I've heard the Nike case study
Yeah.
a few times, and what was on my mind is, does it take a crisis for organizations to learn from others? Because I don't know if Nike would have done any of that without having not been the mess that we're in the first place.
Yeah. In the Nike example, it happened because there was a crisis. Can organizations do and make changes without the crisis? I would say the 90s is so different than now. Like I said to you earlier, I don't know how Nike would have, I'm not sure if Nike could have survived it now. The news and the intensity would have been so hot, red hot, which it should have been. I'm not sure if they could have survived or not, which to me, again, is this part about getting ahead of the authenticity curve. You need to be ahead of the ball game. There's no doubt we all respond to a crisis. I think what I'm trying to sort of suggest in the notion of being authentic and being ahead of the curve on that and being dexterous about complexity is to try to be thinking ahead, to try to not necessarily say the failure is coming, but to be ready for them, to deal with them, because that's the world that we live in. And when a failure comes along, if we're not ready for it, I think our cost and our sort of reaction time is less. The cost of it's greater. The opportunity is also greater if we're ready to deal with that. So it's a great question. It's a really fun one to think about. As I said to you, the question that I'm curious about for all of you, and it's true for me too, is what kind of leader is it I'm called to be in the times that we live in? So thank you guys very much for having me here. I'm going to be around for the afternoon. If you got questions, you want to talk about stuff, please bug me. My email is shoe@paulshoemaker.org. If you want to talk about something, if you want to give me feedback, if you want to ask a question, I'm open to it all. Thank you guys very much.